Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Felipe Contreras Hybrid Wash Processed Guatemala from Manhattan Coffee Roasters. And there's the bag right there. And Manhattan, based out of Rotterdam, Netherlands. And if the name of this coffee also sounds familiar, then that is because we did review a different Felipe Contreras coffee from Manhattan a couple of years ago, and interestingly enough, it's one of the few natural anaerobic processed coffees we've reviewed on this channel that I've actually enjoyed. So when I saw Manhattan release a different version of this coffee and a processing method that's much more in line with my preferences, it's one that immediately caught my attention, and I'm looking forward to discussing it today, as this right here is day 40. And recipe we went with for this coffee is a little different from our standard Manhattan recipe. We went 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 210 degrees Fahrenheit, about 99 degrees Celsius, and I liked this one best through the Chemex, which indicates a more medium grind. Manhattan continues to roast on the lighter side of the spectrum. This one right here isn't necessarily the lightest coffee we've had from Manhattan, but it is still very light by most standards and metrics. Hopefully that gives you a good idea, but with that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 19, first impression, and the cup immediately left an excellent first impression, as it reminded me of two very distinct things. One, it reminded me a lot of the geisha-like characteristics that were present within this coffee. It reminded me of geisha coffees in general, but the other thing this coffee reminded me of was the previous Felipe Contreras coffee that we had reviewed, as that one came out very berry forward. And that was one of the first and most distinct profiles in this coffee, was this very berry forward essence present within the coffee. But in addition to that, the florals were very much at the forefront, in line with the geisha-like characteristics present within this coffee. There were a lot of subtle components to it, as it felt very clean in general. So I felt like there was a little bit to work with here, as a lot of these were much more tame aspects from this first impression, but given just how early it was in this coffee, definitely felt like the best was yet to come. Day 19, ran it through the Chemex, and it was a pretty different cup in the sense that a lot more of the geisha-like components were at the forefront on this day, as it had geisha-like clarity with the geisha-like taste, and that's going to be a recurring theme throughout this review, as this coffee, if I had to describe it in one specific note, I would say it tasted like geisha, which is kind of a weird thing to say, but if you have a lot of familiarity with the way that that variety tastes, it has a very kind of distinct citric floral aspect to it. And that was present within this coffee right from the onset, and pretty much for the entirety of the time drinking it. In addition to that, the listed rose on here is something that can be felt in a fair bit of abundance. Even if it is a little bit more subtle, it is still well defined. So another nice day there on day 19. Day 21, ran it through the April dripper, and this was probably my least favorite of this coffee, as it didn't come out quite as vibrant. There was slightly more of an herbal floral aspect present within the coffee, as well as this kind of citric quality to it. Still red forward, but with a little bit more of a tart berry as opposed to what's felt like a cleaner strawberry aspect. So not necessarily my favorite today. We continue on to day 23, as this was another positive day, as the coffee was coming out a little bit more light, so it was a little tricky to work with on certain days, especially through the V60. That's one of the reasons I settled on the Chemex. We'll get to the other later. But the cup does open up so much as it cools, as the geisha-like characteristics continue to remain on the forefront, especially during the cool down, with the florality and citrus components being the most pronounced components. Day 26, ran it through the Chemex, and at this time it was the best it had been to this point. There were a fair bit of the geisha-like flavor profiles yet again, this floral aspect to it. And the main reason I preferred the Chemex to the V60 was it really did seem to kind of heighten the clarity. So one thing that was a little bit of a deterring factor from the V60 was it could come out ever so slightly grainy, and when it was run through the Chemex, it really seemed to kind of clean that out and accentuate a lot more of the floral characteristics. That's something that will be demonstrated in the tasting wheel, but otherwise it didn't have the same level of clarity given what this coffee was and what I expected it to be. Day 28, back through the V60, and that's one thing I was mentioning, was a slight bit less of that clarity, as there was a slight grainy quality to it, and that oftentimes can happen with coffees that are roasted this light. So I think that was a factor in this one, as the very berry forward aspects were really emphasized on this day, as a lot of the aspects were much more sweet and not quite as clean in general, but even then I was really enjoying the direction that this coffee was going. Day 32. Definitely settled on the Chemex. As kind of mentioned, the cleanliness is really rounded out altogether with the Chemex, and it is much more in line with the listed strawberry as the cup continues to radiate so many of those geisha-like characteristics. Slightly citric, but mostly floral. Best day of the coffee to this point. A lot of these notes, for the most part, pretty consistent. Coffee was pretty consistent throughout the entirety of drinking it. And here on day 35, when I did get sick, which has been something in all of our other notes, back through the Chemex, and it felt like the best day of the coffee to this point, as the added clarity really allowed for a focus on the floral forward aspects of this cup. Somewhat softer, but still at the same time a pronounced berry component to it. I believe that two of the notes that they have listed on here are berry notes, and even then, the most dominant and distinct factor for me is that it tastes geisha-like, and it remained that way throughout the entirety of drinking it. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we were getting. And this looks like a little bit of an old school geisha tasting wheel, but let's go through them real quick. And we have 2 level 5s, so we'll start with the cleanliness level 5. And that's an interesting thing because with the V60, I would probably put it at the higher side of a level 4, and the Chemex really just seemed to kind of finish that off and get it all the way up there to that level 5 mark. But once you do run it through this brew method, then it really does seem to give the coffee a lot more definition, a lot more clarity in general. And for that reason, that was by far my preferred brew method, as it allowed the florality to also reach that level 5 mark. Rose is one thing that they have listed on here, but if anything, I would say it was a little bit more of a geisha-like florality, a slight kind of citric aspect to it, this kind of citric floral component throughout the entirety of the coffee. So that right there definitely justified at that level 5, as those were the 2 most distinct factors for me in this coffee. Then we have a handful of level 4s, and we'll start with the finish at a level 4. Yes, it is a little bit of a softer finish. I at no point expected that to be anything higher than a level 4 or even lower. It is very well, it leaves a very nice profile to it, I would say. That geisha-like finish to it, which is present at the forefront, but also very much the lasting finish that you're getting in this coffee, is a nice aspect to it. Sweetness, level 4. Yes, I don't think I have too much to say on that. It's perfectly there at that level 4 mark, not skewing in any specific direction for that one. Berry fruit, level 4, yes, and I think that the 2 notes that they had listed on here were strawberry, and I believe that there was another berry note on here, but the berry, it's a little bit softer. So I want to kind of focus on the floral aspect because that was more pronounced than the berries, but the berries are present in this coffee just in a slightly more soft manner. And interestingly enough, in the other Felipe Contreras coffee we reviewed, they were in a very strong, pronounced manner. Well, that's not too surprising given the processing method, but it really does go to show that sometimes you can get very similar characteristics from a coffee that's grown at the same farm. Citrus, level 3, I think that has to do with the geisha-like quality that I was experiencing from it, that kind of citric florality within the coffee. It wasn't anywhere near as pronounced as the berry aspects or the floral aspects, but definitely still something I felt in this coffee. And then the last thing I think worth discussing is the acidity at the level 3, and that was another interesting factor for me given how light this coffee is. It didn't necessarily have the most brightness to it. It wasn't an overly acidic coffee, which isn't necessarily a deterring factor for me, as acidity isn't necessarily a huge priority for me, so I was actually quite happy to see that there at that level 3 mark. And I'll actually touch on one more thing real quick, the body at a level 1, and that's likely due to the fact that we ran it through the Chemex and it was a geisha to begin with, so it doesn't necessarily have the most body, but I think given everything else that's present within this tasting wheel, the trade-off was very much worth it for me. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. This one is probably my favorite Guatemalan coffee that we've ever reviewed on this channel. I really can't think of anything that compares to this one, and I've been saying this year that Guatemala's been having a pretty good year, so that's very much in line with this. This is easily one of my favorite coffees that we have reviewed this year, as it had a lot of my traits and characteristics I look for: sweetness, clarity, florality, and while the fruit aspects were a little bit more tame and subtle, they were still very much within this coffee. So for all of those reasons, it very much made it my type of coffee to begin with. And given that it's not something that you traditionally experience with a lot of Guatemalan coffees, that's a nice little added factor to it, given that this coffee is probably a pretty strong favorite to finish in our top 10 coffees of the year list. I think one thing that might prevent it from doing that is if Manhattan has a couple more coffees that we enjoy more than this one. But given that this one's in the Guatemala category, it's a pretty safe bet to probably finish somewhere in that top 10, assuming it's not pushed out by a couple of other Manhattan coffees. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to: if you by chance actually had the other Felipe Contreras, I think that's kind of the first direction I want to point somebody towards, because I enjoyed that one, and that was with it lacking the sort of clarity that this coffee has. This one shares a lot of those same characteristics to it, but with an added bit of florality. So that's the first direction I'd point somebody towards. But then the other one I would point somebody towards is somebody that really likes the taste of geisha, because that's just kind of the experience I had from this coffee, start to finish. The subtle factors are very much pleasant and very nice, but I think that defining factor is what really sold me on this coffee. I think for the most part, I'll leave this review at that. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, would love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Felipe Contreras Hybrid Wash Processed Guatemala from Manhattan Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.